Is your power supply going to be enough for the RTX 4000, and is it even possibly dangerous, such as melting cables? We're going to talk about why, yes, it may actually be pretty dangerous. So if you guys have seen recently, Gamers Nexus and Jay's 2 cents, they have both touched on the subject. Jay's 2 cents thinks it's a very critical issue. Now, specifically, we're talking about the new power connectors on the RTX 4000 series. This may also be an issue on the 4080 and 12 gigabyte. I was about to say 4070, but it's a 4080 12 gigabyte, 4080 16 gigabyte, but primarily this might be a bigger issue on the 4090, which, while having a TDP of 450 watts, it can theoretically draw even more power than that depending on the model and if it's overclocked. So this is going to be an issue with that 12-pin power adapter. Supposedly, first of all, it only has a life cycle of 30 times that you can actually take it in and take it out, 30 to 40 times according to Gamers Nexus, which really isn't all that much if you think about it. There are cables rated for hundreds of hours and things of that nature. So I don't know how often people are going to be unplugging their GPUs, but I know I do it fairly often. I switch a lot of stuff around, and that can certainly be an issue, but that's going to be something more specific to just this power connector. It's not necessarily an Nvidia problem, but while that's a minor issue, the much bigger issue is potentially melting cables and fires and other dangers of that sort with this new cable used on the RTX 4090 specifically. Now, right now, I'd say this is just something to keep your eye on. I wouldn't blow it out of proportion and say that, oh, the RTX 4090 is dangerous if you have an older power supply. Nothing like that. It's something to definitely keep an eye on because problems can happen. Here is a picture of my very own EVGA power supply. As you can see here, the cable melted as well as the connector for the PCIe slot. This was powering an RTX 3090, which isn't even a TI, or it wasn't even something bigger than that. But I guess because of the way that it was cable managed, the cables, normally when you cable manage, you do bend and twist cables to fit in your case and things like that. I had sort of checked in on it a little bit later after I had installed it, after having used it for, I don't even know, it was weeks. And I noticed that the cable was actually melted and I was having problems with it turning on, and that kind of explained the issue right there. So I had to get the entire power supply replaced, with EVGA did do. They replaced it without any issue, but that shows you that even something like this, a basic 4090, if you can call it that, can have these issues. Imagine a 4090 or even a 4090 Ti when that eventually comes out at perhaps 600 watts or who knows what type of crazy number. So this is something to keep an eye on. According to them, when you do bend and twist the cable, that does increase the risk of the cable malfunctioning. And of course, these cables are putting together a considerable amount of power. And specifically, we're talking about older power supplies, the ATX 2.0. So the question is going to come up, are you going to have to upgrade to an ATX 3.0 power supply? And now a word from our sponsor. Priced pretty good is a Windows CD key. Today's video sponsor is going to be VIP-CDKdeals.com. Very simple process. You can get a Windows 10 Pro CD key and remember to use code CC20 for a nice discount. And now back to the video. Now, judging from the speculation right now, remember these GPUs aren't even released yet, so this is all very early speculation. If you're going to get an RTX 4090, it's probably a good idea to think about getting an ATX 3.0 power supply. I mean, there aren't that many on the market yet. It's a very new type of standard, but as time passes and you have to upgrade, certainly a pretty good idea. What I personally think about it, I'm not too happy having to upgrade the power supply simply because recently with one of the EVGA sales, I just got a monster 1600 watt titanium power supply. So I thought that was going to be good for at least 10 years. Now, with something like that, the power is more than sufficient, but now with the 4090, it's like, do I need to get a 3.0 now and spend who knows how much more and maybe get rid of this one? So certainly not the best situation, because after all, as much as I like upgrading parts, unless it's something that really gives you a benefit, I'd rather keep something, especially a titanium power supply. I thought that was going to be bulletproof. Who knew that you're going to need a 3.0 standard because of the way that the power cable is going to communicate with the power supply? I guess guess it makes sense. These are not just dumb connectors. There's a lot of smart technology going on there with power management and things of that nature. When you turn on your computer, you don't want it shooting all that power through the cable, therefore increasing issues. So it does make sense that a new standard like ATX 3.0 would be smarter in terms of its management of the power of a GPU and your overall system, and therefore be less likely to give you issues. So this is before we even start talking about the wattage and whatever specification of the power supply. This is simply ATX 2.0 versus 3.0. Of course, nobody's going to have 3.0 because it's such a new technology. So it's going to be a question of, do you upgrade? I've even heard of some friends of mine saying they may consider not getting the 4090 just because of these power issues with the cables. They're a little bit scared. They're going to have to get a whole new power supply, adding already to the massive cost. Of course, somebody looking at a 4090 typically will have some pretty beefy specs or the ability to buy a more expensive power supply. But think of it this way, most of these people, myself included, we just upgraded our computers during RTX 3000. The 3090 Ti just came out this year. That's a very high-end GPU that also requires some pretty beefy power. Now, it's not like we've been holding on to stuff for 3 or 4 years and it's outdated. So people recently upgraded, and to have to go change to an entirely new standard on something like a power supply certainly might make somebody a little bit apprehensive. Now, what is the amount of power that you're going to need? For a 4090, depending on the processor that you have and whatever else is in your system, I mean, 1,000 watts seems like low. I guess that could be a minimum, but I would go with the minimum of maybe 1,200 watts. Who knows how much that 4090 will spike to, even though there supposedly will be better power management. So 1,200 watts, 1,300 watts, even a 1,500 or 1,600 watt power supply, I don't think it's overkill anymore for a 4090 system, especially if you're going to be running one of the newest generations processors that certainly eat up a lot of power, like the Intel 12900K, 13900K, whatever comes out from AMD soon. Those are certainly not going to be sipping power. They're going to be putting out a considerable amount of performance, adding to your whole system wattage. So I would recommend, if you're looking for a 4090, a couple of things you're going to have to be worried about here. First, of course, at the very basic level, get high wattage, because you're simply going to need it. A 6 or even a 750 watt power supply simply will not be enough to take care of such a high-end GPU, and you should have something greater than that if you're going for such an expensive GPU as well. You want to get at least, I would say, 1,200 watts plus to be safe. You may be able to get away with 1,000 watts if you have it now, and your CPU, maybe you have like a 5900X or something like that. You should be okay, of course, but I would recommend more. And then your second problem is, do you go to ATX 3.0? This melting cable issue could be a potential deal breaker. In my opinion, if you're going to be running a 4090 with a very high-end CPU, I think you're going to be giving yourself some, doubts when you're actually gaming if your ATX 2.0 power supply is going to be okay, especially depending on how you have to bend those cables and cable manage. So I would say, for peace of mind and to make sure you don't have any of these issues, you really should probably consider an ATX 3.0 power supply. I hadn't even personally looked into them all that much because I wasn't really looking forward to having to upgrade that part, having done so recently. But if it's something that we can actually prove with science and mathematics and people's experiences, that is going to be a massive safety improvement for the function of an RTX 4090, I may just have to be forced, along with other people, into getting a newer power supply, and I guess just selling my old one if that's really going to make that big of a difference. According to Jay's 2 cents and Gamers Nexus, it certainly is an issue, and like I showed you the picture of my EVGA power supply that was on simply a 3090, it can certainly happen. I mean, I'm not sure why it happened in that case, but as you can see, the cable completely melted, and this was just during regular gaming usage. And now this was a 1,300 watt platinum power supply, so more than sufficient to handle a 3090. Maybe the way the cable was, cable managed or something like that caused this, but going forward in the future, people certainly don't want to see these type of problems, perhaps even resulting in more serious fires and things like that, with something as powerful as a 4090. Now, if you're going to go for the 4080 16 gigabyte and not, of course, the 4080 12 gigabyte, I don't think anybody should buy that regardless of a power supply or not. Let's say the 4080 16 gigabyte, that's going to be closer in power to maybe a current 3090 Ti. Then maybe you have a little bit more leeway because it's not pushing the same amount of performance and power and wattage wattage requirements as a 4090. So there you may have a little bit more chance to ponder. But if you're going for a 4090, I would definitely keep my eye on this one. According to Jay's 2 cents, he thinks it's going to be almost essential or very important to get an ATX 3.0 power supply. At the moment, I don't have enough information to make that distinction if it's going to be really relevant 100% of the time, but judging from how much power the 4090 is pulling out, and by maybe the smarter technology in ATX 3.0, maybe that makes sense. Maybe it is something that everybody's going to have as a requirement going forward. It's a little early to see now. I mean, if you want to be safe, it's definitely going to be the way to go, unless there are other, hidden gremlins or other compatibility issues that pop up with ATX 3.0 that can give you other problems you weren't expecting. Stuff is always possible with new technology. We're in a point now where we're kind of transferring from that ATX 2.0 to the 3.0 standard. PCIe generation 4, PCIe generation 5. A lot of things are actually changing very quickly. So if you're going to be on the cutting edge of technology, especially with an RTX 4090, I think you should expect to run into some potential issues. You just, of course, want to minimize catastrophic issues like fires that can, cause much more damage your hardware and be dangerous and things like that. That's why it's definitely something to think about, to keep an eye on. All right, guys, so let me know down below if you're going to get an RTX 4090 and an ATX 3.0 power supply is something that you're really considering. Let me know what else you think about this subject. Remember to subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next video. And now a word from our sponsor. Priced pretty good is a Windows CD key. Today's video sponsor is going to be VIP-CDKdeals.com. Very simple process. You can get a Windows 10 Pro CD key, and remember to use code CC20 for a nice discount. And now back to the video.